we're going to talk about what you need to get started in beekeeping. I'm going to tell you right off the bat that there are a lot of beekeeping catalogs out there. And when you open them up, there is every kind of gizmo and gadget that you can think of in those catalogs. You don't have to have all of that stuff to keep bees, to say the least. But all these companies, they want to sell you every one of those. So that's part of the game. But because of that, we're going to take and go through everything. And everything that I'm going to show you in here, I'm going to explain different parts and pieces and the roles that they play within the hive. Also, the other thing that I'm going to talk about is things that you absolutely have to have will be shown here. There's not going to be a lot of fluff in this for different little things that you don't have to have. So we're going to dive right in. First off, this is, to my left here, is what we call a Langstroth hive. By large in part, this is probably predominantly for the industry, the most used hive. And as you can see, there's various pieces to it, and we're going to go through those. Different companies do things a little bit differently. This is one of our hives here that we're going to be demonstrating with. But the first piece that we're going to talk about is the hive stand. And some companies make this piece separate. Some people make it together. Our hive stand is built into the bottom board, so you don't have to worry about buying a separate piece. Basically what a hive stand does is it gives you this 45-degree angle on the front of the hive. You got to remember, bees, when in the early spring, late fall, they're loaded heavy with nectar and pollen. So our weather oftentimes is windy and different things like that. So when it's windy and they're loaded that heavy, they've flown maybe 3-4 miles with a load like that. So they're very tired when they come in, and sometimes that wind can literally blow them to the ground, and it's very hard for them to pick up and to fly again. So this just enlarges the landing area to where they have a wider surface to hit and then crawl on into the hive. This particular piece is optional unless you buy it from a company that sells it with just one particular piece. The advantage of that is if you ever have to move the hive, it's all one piece instead of having to handle two. So that's the benefit of one piece. The other thing is this particular piece, when it's all built together, is what we call a screen bottom board. And what it does, screen bottom boards aid with mite fall. They also aid with trash and debris falling out of the hive. And basically this particular style, in my opinion, mimics nature. What do I mean when I say that? Well, if you think about it, think about a hollow bee tree for a minute. Why is it hollow? Well, most of the time the tree's dead, right? All right, so inside that tree, the bees go up, they build their comb, and they start drawing it down. They don't draw it all the way down to the bottom of that cavity. Well, why do they do that? Well, it's because they leave a natural debris cavity in the bottom of that tree. So when they drop pollen, wax debris, different things like that, it will fall down there. The pollen is protein, so the ants will then come up in there and clean that out for them. So they don't like to live in their own filth, so to speak. So basically this gives them that debris cavity, whereas the solid bottom board that's shown on the right-hand side of the screen doesn't necessarily give that debris cavity. It can collect up in there. Excuse me. And besides letting light into the hive, let's go back to the hollow bee tree again. It has the hollowness there because it's a dead tree. And oftentimes in a dead tree, there'll be a knot hole or a crack in that tree that the bees are entering and exiting out of. And then up above, there'll be a limb or the tops broke out of that tree, so it gives it a natural air current in that tree. And that's very important, especially in the wintertime, because it's not moisture. I mean, it's not cold that kills bees, it's moisture. So that natural air current in that hive helps to dry that moisture off. And when bees are pulling in nectar and they're dehydrating it, there's a tremendous amount of moisture in a hive. So If you don't have that natural air current in there, basically what it would be like is if you went outside and it's 30 degrees and it's sunshine, and it's not bad. But if it's 30 degrees and it's raining, then it gets cold and your body goes through more carbohydrates to keep itself warm. And what is carbohydrates? Well, for bees, it's honey consumption. Also, the other thing is we mentioned the light that it lets into the hive. That can also give you a control element when it comes to hive beetles and different things. Because if there's light that comes in from the bottom board, it drives the beetles up into the cluster. The bees aren't going to let them be there. You put hive beetle traps in a hive, then the bees are going to, and you keep your hive nice and tight, lots of bees in it, then the bees are going to push them to those traps. You slide this in with the Cortex board, and or some companies offer an oil tray that you can put underneath these to catch beetles. You close the light out. The bees do their job. They push the beetles out of the cluster. Because there's no light down here, they'll come down, they'll go through the screen and get in that oil tray. So that's different ways of controlling the beetles. Also, you will need one of these. We're going to build this hive starting from the bottom and going to the top. This is an entrance reducer. When you get a package of honeybees, oftentimes with that, you get somewhere about 5,000 to 7,000 bees in a package, and that's a relatively small number of bees compared to a full-blown colony of 60,000 to 80,000 bees per colony. And so because of that, you need to narrow the entrance down where it doesn't take as many guard bees to guard the entrance and protect from things like yellow jackets, hornets, wasps, different things that are going to be drawn to what you're feeding the bees and to the nectar and the honey that's in the hive. So basically, that's just placed here in the entrance, so y'all might not be able to see that if I set it down on there just like that, giving them an entrance to go into the hive. So that's the base of our hive. So what's next? As we mentioned, some people offer tray systems. This is one that we offer here. Next, we need to understand supers, hive bodies, deep, medium, shallow. If you've ever looked at a beekeeping catalog and you're not familiar with it, it can be very confusing. So we're going to see if we can unmuddy the water for you. The top box on that stack is shallow. That's basically referring to when you say shallow, medium, or deep. What that's referring to is the width of the box this way, from top to bottom. A shallow is 5 11/16 of an inch tall, a medium is 6 5/8, and a deep is 9 5/8. Shallows are predominantly used for honey supers. Why? Because a deep 10-frame box can weigh anywhere from 90 to 110 pounds. They can get very heavy quick. And so by narrowing that down and making that box hold less honey, it's easier to move it around. So that's why a lot of people, if they're using deeps, go to shallows or mediums to lighten that load up for them. But like I said, shallows are mainly used for honey supers. Mediums gets even more confusing because in some catalogs, they use 2 or 3 different names for them. And again, mediums just referring to the height of the box. Some catalogs will call them Illinoises. Some people will refer to them as an Illinois brood box, or some people will refer to them as a honey super. But all of those things, when you say medium honey super, it just means the height of the box, or Illinois super or brood box. We know that means that it's 6 5/8 of an inch tall. Deep, they're predominantly used for brood boxes. Some people do use them for honey supers. I don't like to do that myself. It's a lot of weight to move around a lot, but I do know some guys that do that. It's up to you how you want to do these. But those are the 3 names of the boxes and all the different ways that they're referred to. And if I get to going too fast or anything, write your questions down. We'll get to them at the end, okay? Now we're going to talk about the different hive configurations that you can run. Some people will run a single deep brood box. Now when we say brood box, what does that mean? Well, that just means that this box is going to be used for raising young bees, your brood. A queen will go about 18 to 20 inches high laying eggs before her brood nest domes out. And So you can keep that figure in mind when it comes to the height of the boxes. You just have to equal the cubic space of the brood nest. For instance, if you're doing 2 deeps, let's just say for round figures, for figure's sake here, they're 9.5 inches tall. A queen goes 18 to 20 inches high. What's 9.5 and 9.5? So that makes up that brood nest area where that dome is going to dome out. Then she's going to naturally transition to honey. So some people will do a single deep brood box. This most of the time is more southerly areas because it takes at least 55 to 60 pounds of honey to overwinter a colony of European honeybees here. That's what the state of Tennessee recommends. So that would be more along the lines of what you see here of running 2 deep brood boxes to give you that. Then we see this, we go with double deeps for our brood boxes, and then again, some people will transition over to using a medium for a honey super for the weight factor. So that's one thing that you really need to think about is what is your lifting capacity? How much work do you want to do when you're doing all this? If you get into it, I recommend that you start with at least 2 hives. And the reason for that is you, as a beginner, if you've never been into bees before, you may think that this hive is doing very well, when in all actuality it's doing terrible. If you don't have something to compare to, you won't know that. So that's a good way of doing it. It's not that we're trying to sell you another hive or more equipment, but it's really needed. And then some people will do this particular system. I will say that predominantly this is probably 90% of my business now, is doing, a lot of people are doing all mediums. And there's reasons for that, and we're going to get to those. And again, look at it like this. A medium brood box is, let's just say, 6.5 inches for round figures. Most of the time, people will run 3 mediums for their brood boxes. What does that equal? 3 times 6.5. See, it's the same cubic space that you're making up there and making their brood area. Queen excluder is a very controversial piece of equipment in the beekeeping world. You ask 10 beekeepers like Jake brought out last night, and they'll tell you 10 different things, maybe 20. But with queen excluders, you have to remember why they came onto the market in the first place. Years and years ago, a lot of people did cut comb honey, to where that they actually have the comb, and they would eat the honey out of the comb. Well, they wanted to make sure that a queen didn't go up there and lay an egg in that. And the reason for that is when a queen bee lays an egg in the cell, and that bee hatches out, goes through all of its cycles and hatches out, well, it leaves behind a cocoon in that cell. So they didn't want those cocoons left in that honey that they were going to eat. So because of that, they came up with this system of queen excluder to put on there to make sure that that didn't happen. Also, people didn't have extractors. It wasn't as readily available as what it is now. And it's not as much of an issue if a queen goes up and she lays some eggs in a frame of honey. Oftentimes, if you'll wait and the honey flow is very strong, those eggs will hatch out. And then those bees, like I said, if the honey flow is very strong, they'll backfill those cells with nectar, and then they will eventually cap over. And if they've got cocoons in there, it doesn't matter. We're going to uncap it, we're going to sling it out, and then put it back into the colony. Also, extractors also help your bees in other ways, because if you've got a frame of wax, that's very valuable to your bees. It takes bees at least 7 to 8 pounds of honey to make 1 pound of wax. So if you're taking and cutting that wax out, doing cut comb, you're also knocking the bees back. They also have to rebuild that so that some of what they're taking in is going back to rebuilding comb rather than storing it. So that's another thing. But so basically, long and the short of it is queen excluders are to keep the queen out of the honey supers. And this would be the placement of it. You would have, if you're doing mediums like what's shown here, you'd have 3 medium brood boxes, and then you would have your queen excluder between your brood boxes and your honey super. Now, the other thing is different types of feeder systems. What we're going to show you here, we talked about our boxes, and we're going to get into some more of those here in just a second, some more details about them. But we're going to talk about feeder systems. One of the ones we actually make and design, designed and made the one that you see here, and it has some specific benefits. We talked about the brood nest. It domes out at about 18 to 20 inches high. It looks like an upside down bowl in a hive. And if you want me to explain more about that, you can come up to me afterwards and I'll draw this out for you so it makes more sense. But basically it looks like an upside down bowl. On the outside of that upside down bowl, in the outer corners of the hive, they'll store their honey. And if you think about it, bees eat honey, right? So when they go into the hive and you're thinking about it, if you were a bee and you were hungry and you wanted to eat, which direction would you travel, up or down? So the answer is obvious. You'd travel up. So really, in essence, if you feed bees from the top, you're helping to mimic their natural way of doing things. You're working with nature in that sense. The benefit to a hive top feeder like this is it holds a lot. It supplies a lot of food to the bees very quickly. The other thing is that in the industry, you'll see kits a lot of times sold with entrance feeders like this. In the springtime of the year, it works great. Bees go through good economic times and bad economic times, just like humans do. Good economic times, everybody's in a good mood, right? Money's flowing, jobs are good. Bad economic times, everybody's grouchy, ill, stealing, robbing goes up, all those different things. Well, bees, when good economic times are here, nectar flows on. So we're not concerned with if you've got this big jar of food sitting on the outside of your hive, because we're able to go out and get it for ourselves. But in the fall of the year, we're basically it'd be like somebody in bad economic times putting a sack full of cash in your house and then telling everybody in the neighborhood and just waiting for something to happen. So basically, in the fall, this particular feeding system can cause robbing. The other thing is where is this feeder placed on the hive? Well, it's placed on the bottom. Again, going back to nature, which way does bees want to travel? So you're going to see a higher effective rate on hive top feeders and getting the bees to take down feed. Another type of feeder system that you can use is a 2 or a 4 jar feeder. We have an inner cover, which we're going to explain what it does here in just a second. But we have an inner cover, and it has an oval hole right in the middle of it right here. And then it also has a notch cut in the rim. These 2 and 4 jar feeder systems, once you place your inner cover on there, you can place that little framework over that oval hole. The oval hole allows the bees to move up into the framework. There's screen nailed underneath those holes. You can set mason jars over those holes with one-piece lids. You don't want to use cannon rings and lids for this because you've got a ring and then a lid behind it. So when you invert that, the lid is actually depressed. And so a bee's proboscis, or his tongue, if you've got the screen under it like that, sometimes cannot be long enough to reach that. So it's very important to use a one-piece lid with these type systems. But you can do this, once you place that rim or that framework or that feeder here, now we can put an empty box over the top to shroud that. And then we can put our lid on top of that so that the jars aren't exposed. So those are all good types of feeder systems from the top that you can use. Now, inner cover always goes on the very top of your hive. It doesn't matter if you're taking your feeders off. It would go right over the top bars of the frames, right on top like this, and it always goes under the inner cover like this. And the reason for the notch is again, going back to the hollow bee tree that we talked about earlier, it has to have that airflow, right? So that's what the notch is for. Because if we just put this lid directly on top of the hive, then we have a dead air space, and there's not any airflow there. So that's what gives you that. The other thing is that it doesn't matter if you're running a hive top feeder. A lot of people will try to put this inner cover on top of the hive and then put the feeder on top of that. That slows the bees down. You're also going to get burr comb between here where the bees are going to store it. It always goes on top of the hive like this, the very last piece of equipment before the lid. Okay, doesn't matter if you're running a feeder or just straight on top of the boxes. Now, one thing about it is it takes 850 bees, 50 trips apiece, to bring a quart of water to a beehive a day to cool it. A queen bee is kept 92 to 94 degrees year-round in the core of the cluster. Our temperatures can get pretty high here in Tennessee. And so we don't want our bees to have to work to heat nor to cool. So that's the reason why there's two different types of inner covers like that. This is a solid inner cover. Most people run this in the wintertime. It slows that airflow down. And generally speaking, a lot of people will ask, well, when do you put that on? Let the bees tell you. You'll know when the bees are hot and they're having to cool the hive because they do what they call bearding out. They'll beard out all over the front of the hive, and they'll hang kind of like in wads of bees. And what they're doing is they're hauling water, they're putting it on the entrance, and then they're fanning air, pushing air through that hive, creating their own air conditioning. So when that happens and you start seeing a lot of bearding, then you can switch that out and give them a little relief. Also, one thing, and I just thought about this, you also, on our screen bottom boards, you remember I showed that plastic piece in the bottom? It's very important if you're installing package bees or nukes, either one. If you're using screen bottom boards, when you install those, make sure that that plastic piece is slid in. Bees draw wax better in the dark. They also need to feel safe and secure when you install them in the hive. And they generally start in the middle of the box and work their way out to the outer edges. So one thing about that is once they've got that first box filled and you add your second one, you can pull that plastic piece out and leave it because then it's dark in that second box. And that will help them. If I have seen times to where bees have absconded if you forget that. So just a note to self there. That's an important point. Okay. Then basically once we've got our feeder on, our inner covers in place, then we're going to go to the outer cover. There's different types of outer covers out there used for different purposes, but unless you plan on hauling bees on pallets or putting them on the back end of a truck or semi-truck and hauling them down the road, then predominantly a telescope and outer cover like this one would be the one that you would use. And it always goes on the top of the hive, and it just basically water tights the hive. Now, I told you we were going to go into the boxes just a little bit more, and this also is a very important point. If you notice, we talked about deep, medium, and shallow, but there's also two different sizes of hive. There's an 8-frame hive and a 10-frame hive. Basically, what those terminologies mean is basically how many frames does the box hold? This particular hive is an 8-frame that you're looking at. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, just like that. So 8 frames total. Now, the other thing that you have to think about when it comes to all of this, and basically that's an 8-frame deep, and on the bottom there, that's a 10-frame deep. A 10-frame deep is, again, what does deep refer to? Refers to the height of the box. 8 and 10 frame refers to the width of the box. So 16 inches, 16 and a quarter on the bottom, 13 and 3/4 on the top. That's the difference. Okay, and then for each box, we also have to have a frame. All boxes, it doesn't matter if it's deep, medium, or shallow. All of the boxes are the same length. They're 19 7/8 of an inch long. It doesn't matter if they're a deep box, a medium box, or a shallow box, because they all have to fit the same hive. And then we have wax that fits those particular frames. We have deep wax will fit a deep frame, medium wax will fit a medium frame, and a shallow piece of wax will fit a shallow frame. Now, it doesn't matter if you order it from me or Kelly's, Daydam, whoever. It's very important to know the particular frame style that you use in a hive, because depending on the frame style, there will be wax to fit each one of those frame styles, depending on. Like the particular frame style that we use is what they call a groove bottom, and if you can see up in here, there's a groove in this bottom bar with a wedged top bar, which what a wedged top bar means is that just means it has a removable wedge that can be broken out. And if you look closely at those pictures, you'll see that foundation has wires in it. What the wires are for is to support the wax. And when you get into the extracting process, and it also helps the wax to keep from sagging and if in the hive when it gets hot. If you also look at the end bars of the frame here, there's holes drilled in it. That's for cross wiring or supporting it that way so that it doesn't sag. Or a lot of people now just pin their frames. If you're not going to be hauling them down the road, that will work too. If you use, I like to use just a straight up bobby pin, and you can take and push the bobby pin through the hole, let it straddle the wax on each side, and that will support that wax. But if you can buy these frames assembled or unassembled. If you decide to assemble them yourself, make sure you do a good job. You got to remember that these frames sometimes will last you 4 or 5 years if you take good care of them. And they're going to go in an extractor more than that, and that puts a lot of pressure on those frames as the centrifugal force slings the honey out. Well, if you don't do a good job, you will regret it. I promise you. So make sure you take the time to slow down and do it right the first time. True story. I went to inspect a guy's hives and went out there and went to pull the first frame, and the whole top bar come off in my hand. He didn't put any nails in his frames. He thought you just popped them together. So now we've got to nail these frames, and there's bees all over the frames, and they built comb in them. So you can imagine how that went. So very important to do the job correctly. And that's the reason why they're doing these classes in the fall. You've got all winter to get this done. So make sure you get your stuff early. Make sure you give yourself plenty of time to learn and to do it right. That way you're not pressed. The worst thing in the world is you've got a package of bees and nothing to put them in, and you're running to get it done. Because they're not canned goods. They can't sit on a shelf and just wait. They will die. Okay, so what is the differences between 8-frame and 10-frame hives? We see the progression downward. We see 10-frame that has come onto the market in Langstroth hives, and we got to ask ourselves, if we're a thinking person, why is that? And we're going to get into that. But in 10-frame hives, oftentimes what you see is the bees won't pull frame 1 and frame 10. And so that means a rotation of frames. What does that mean when we say a rotation of frames? That's basically where we're going to have to pull frame 1 because they didn't draw it out, push frame 2 over into position 1, and drop the other frame in. When you do that, you have the potential of rolling a queen or damaging her. So the more manipulation you've got to do, the more chances. So by using a smaller 8-frame hive, it condenses the cluster into a more natural size. Most of the time in a hollow bee tree, it's 6 to 8 combs that they draw. It also, when you're doing 10-frame, it kind of gives a little bit more of a learning curve from what I've seen, because I've actually had people that have come into the shop that were waiting for them to draw frame 1 and frame 10 and didn't have the other box, and they swarmed because they're out of room. Because bees like to move vertically, they don't like to move too far horizontally. And so because of that, when you narrow the hive up, we have a saying with 8 frame, 1 and 8, don't be late. So in other words, when they got frame 1 and 8, 90% drawn out, then we add another box. They're ready for another box. So it kind of takes a little bit of that learning curve out, whereas in 10 frame, it would be frame 2 and 9 that you would add another box to it. So it's a little bit easier with swarm control in that way. Less chances to roll the queen, we mentioned that. Better pest management. Let's talk about that for just a minute. If bees aren't pulling frame 1 and frame 10 that readily, what is it that draws the wax out? That's right, bees. So when the bees, if there's no wax being drawn on those outside frames, what does that mean that there's little to none of on there? Right, there's fewer bees on those outside frames. So if you're a pest like a hive beetle or something like that, where would you go to lay your eggs if the bees aren't letting you in the cluster? Right, so again, keeping that hive nice, tight, and compact will help with that problem. Also, there's less money lost when it comes to unused frames and foundation. You're paying for 2 frames and 2 sheets of wax per box if there's nothing going on with it that you don't have to have. The other thing is also your boxes that will cost you more. So basically, what we're talking about here is standardization of equipment. No matter what it is that you decide to go with, deep boxes, 8 frame, 10 frame, whatever, pick a plan and go with it. Don't start mixing things up. It's going to be a nightmare if you do. You got to remember, if you've got 3 different size boxes for 3 different uses, then you've got 3 different size frames and 3 different size sheets of wax that you're going to have to keep in stock to be able to manipulate or to work with your hive. So basically, if like we mentioned, a lot of people have going with one size box. Well, what does that mean when it comes to standardization of equipment? Well, it means that my medium box here will fit, or my medium frame will not only fit this medium box, but the medium box that's on this hive that was the blind squirrel that never found the nut. In other words, they didn't make any honey. And so I can take honey off of a hive that did very well, and I can put it on a hive that didn't make very much honey and help get them through the winter. So because I can interchange frames, or I can take a box of honey and put it over there. The other thing is that if I need to condense a hive down because I have a queen problem, that means that I can take a medium frame out of my medium box and put it into a medium nuke box and condense them down so I can figure out how to fix that problem. The other thing is that if I need a medium brood box for the bees to lay eggs in, I've got it. If I need a medium honey super, I've got it. I can put it on. Whereas if you start mixing boxes and you're using shallows for honey supers, then, I don't have any shallows. You got more chances of being out of something at any one given time. Now, the other things that you need are different types of beekeeping tools. And we're going to go over the basic stuff. As you can see, you're going to need a smoker at some particular point. A lot of beekeepers in their first year, because of the way that things are, they say, oh, well, I never lit the smoker the entire year. My bees were just as calm as they could be. Trust me, you're going to need one. The other thing is with that smoker, you might want to think about like a long stem grill lighter to where you can light that smoker. We also have a bee brush. That's very important. You will need one at some particular point for different operations. That's for brushing the bees off. I encourage people to try to work their bees without gloves. Your dexterity is so much better. You'll be more gentle with the bees, so on and so forth. And when you're more gentle, you don't upset the bees because you're tearing stuff up, banging around in the hive because you've got these big clumsy gloves on. Now, you're probably not going to be comfortable with that to start out with, but I encourage you to work towards that. Pull your glove off, take your smoker, smoke your hand down, and start just one hand at a time if you have to. But again, because bees go through good economic times and bad economic times, in the fall your bees' attitude is going to change. So you're going to see that they sometimes have a bad hair day. And so you're going to need those gloves close by sometimes to put on. so you can get in and get what you need done and go on. But encourage you again, try to work without them. Definitely, at least a veil. It's very important to wear a veil. Eye protection is a major big thing. You can lose the sight in your eye if you get stung in the eye. So definitely make it a practice to put a veil on before you go out to a hive. Now, if you're not comfortable with that, there are beekeeping suits that you can buy. You can buy a full coverall suit. It goes from your ankles to the top of your head, and you'll be covered. There are cotton suits. There are ventilated suits. There is a benefit, in my opinion, to a ventilated suit because it gets hot in Tennessee. And if you've ever put a jacket on in midsummer in the blaring sun, you will appreciate it. And with a ventilated suit, you could go out with your shorts underneath it and your t-shirt and never get stung, because it basically has a tight mesh on the inside of the sleeve or on the inside of the suit, a foam mesh on top of that, and then another tight mesh on top of that. So it creates a thick layer that the bee's stinger cannot penetrate or get through. So those are nice. But a cotton suit will get you by too. Just different ways of doing things. Okay, any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Can you repeat what you were saying when you were talking about the screened inner cover, and you said don't forget to take something off? The plastic tray. The plastic.
Oh, on the screen bottom board. That's on the screen bottom board. Screen bottom board has a removable plastic piece. When you install your package or your nuke, you want to make sure that this is in. Okay? And the reason for that is when we place that first box on there, it's nice and dark for them. But as you're waiting for them to draw out that first box, you want to, once a week when you do your inspections, you want to pull this out, clean any debris off of this board that they've dropped, and put it back in. Why? Because this screen keeps the bees out of the area below. So when they drop that pollen and wax particles and everything else, there will be different pests that get in here and try to lay their eggs. So by keeping that cleaned off, we're warding that off and keeping them from crawling back up into the hive. Once you add your second box and it's dark up there, then you can take this out and leave it out. Okay? But don't throw it away. A lot of people will do that because you're going to need this for mite monitoring in the fall. Okay. Yes, sir.
I noticed none of the stuff is fastened, it just stacks. Is that the standard? How come wind or things can't knock it over?
That's a good question. If you remember last night, Jake talked about propolis. Propolis is the bee glue of the world. And it is awesome stuff. But once the bees get in there, the reason why they put propolis, bees coat the entire inside of the hive with propolis. Propolis is antibacterial, antifungal. It is basically the bee's external immune system. Okay, so when you put those boxes together and they start propolizing, you'll get a little film, believe it or not, between the boxes. And over a period of time, it starts building up. And that's why we have to have a hive tool to pop those boxes loose. Now, the other thing is it's standard beekeeping issue that once you get these all stacked up here, and you got your lid on there, you need a well-placed rock. And basically that just kind of keeps your lid from blowing off or anything like that, because the bees most of the time don't get up here, especially if you're running feeders. But if you've got your inner cover, then they can even propolize the lid down. But generally as a rule, I mean, have they been blown over? Yes. In a tornado, I saw 70 colonies get tossed. But I mean, that's pretty extreme, you know. If you're worried about that in bad weather, we actually have a hive stand that we sell, and it's steel, and then you can run a strap from one side of it to the other to hold it all together if that's something you're worried about. All right, so the shallow boxes, they're mostly used for honey supers, but look at the medium. Medium is used for brood boxes or honey supers, either one, because basically a shallow is not enough surface area on the frame really to raise brood in. It cuts it down too much. But if you're using all mediums, you can use them either or that way. But if you're going with like deeps like that, most people will drop back on their honey supers to mediums or shallows. Does that make sense? That way it's cutting down the weight in there. You don't have to, you can keep going straight on up with mediums in your honey supers. You don't have to change unless you just want to. And don't be afraid to ask questions. There's no dumb questions. Yes, there can be places in the yard that is conducive to pests. You don't want to put them in areas where there's a lot of rotting debris, leaves, stuff like that, that's going to hold moisture to the ground, because hive beetles like to nest up under the leaves. If you're a gardener and you have a compost pile, they love compost piles because they hold moisture to the ground. The ground's usually soft under them. It's easy for them to bore into, and they love rotting debris. And I don't know if Jake mentioned this last night, but a 4 to 5% moisture content in the soil, hive beetles have to have that to bore into the soil, pupate, and come back out. And at a 94 degrees, they have a 98% hatch-off rate in a hive. So basically, to combat hive beetles, you want full sun, if at all possible, the hive facing east, southeast. That way the sun hits the front of the box, gets the girls out, and get them working early. We don't want them laying around doing nothing. But the other thing is that talking about hives, putting them together. Generally speaking, I put my hives on a rail system, and there'll be enough space in between hives that I can off-stack the equipment between them. Now, with that being said, if you place them in a straight row, guess what? The two hives on the very end of those rows are always going to be the strongest, because in good economic times, when the honey flow's on, it's like somebody offering to bring $1 million into your house in cash. Are you going to stop them? Come right on in. And so the same thing is true. When bees are bringing nectar and pollen in, even though they don't belong there, bees will let them in because they're bringing nectar and pollen in. And that's what we call drift. So if you have 10 hives painted and they're all white, it's kind of like you flying over L.A. saying, which one of these is my house? You know, they all look the same. So because of that, the end ones that have a zip code, so to speak, that are different from them, have nothing beside them over here, are always going to be the strongest hives. In the middle, are always going to be your weakest hives because of that drift factor. So we can play with the bees in that sense. And you can only do this in good nectar flow times is that when this hive is very strong and the forage bees are out, I can take my weak hive from the center and switch them. And the reason for that is the forage bees that are coming in with nectar and pollen will then build up my weak hive. So, but that's only during a nectar flow. Did that answer your question? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
So if you have just two hives, would you put them next to each other?
I would because, and again, you got to remember that when you go to harvest honey or do anything else, and when you lay your yards out, it's very important to think about too is the fact that you're going to have to get a truck, a cart of some sort at least, to get the honey off of them. You know, you need to be able to get to them to manipulate them. So a lot of guys, they put them in some odd spots and they're hard to get to, but I like to be able to pull my truck up pretty close to them. I was talking with Gene earlier, telling him about this particular situation. There was a woman in Chattanooga. She had a similar situation. You just have to use good common sense when it comes to that. She put her hives right on the corner of where the sidewalk was, where the kids picked up off the school bus. So you got to use common sense and think about other people in that sense. Bees most of the time won't bother anybody, and they don't know that they're around. Here's the way it works. It's better for them to get sun in the morning so it gets them out. And then if they get sun up to 1 o'clock, something like that, that would probably be okay. It's not ideal, but it would probably be okay in that sense because they get enough sunlight through the day to keep the yard dry, the dirt, the soil. So that would be okay in that sense. But if not, then you may want to kind of rethink that. Bees cluster at about 50 to 55 degrees because they keep that queen 92 to 94 degrees year round. And because of that, when they cluster up around them and they're going to stay in there, the weather drops down and it's going to stay below that, then you can move them. Bees have a 3-day-old memory. Think about it. If bees never forgot, they would never move on and pollinate other sources, would they? They'd always go back to the one that they found first. And so because of that, we can use that when moving bees. So if they're going to be in the hive for 3, 4, 5 days with the weather drop down low like that, then we can move them, put them in the other area, and they'll be just fine. They'll never go back. But if you don't have that 3-day-old period there and you move them from here to the other side, there'll be a ball of bees sitting on the ground where this hive is. So that's the difference. And if you go to move them, make sure you ratchet strap it together. True story. Moving some hives one time with a hive lifter, and the hive lifter is where 2 guys get on each side of this and it fits in the handhole so you can pick up the entire hive. And the hive lifter slipped out. We dropped the whole thing. And so because of that, make sure you keep them strapped together. And then when you go to move them, if you don't have weather like that, screen them in. Do it the night before you're going to move them. And then do that way. In Bon Aqua, that's just south of Dixon, off of I-840. We're about 2 miles off of I-840 on the other end towards Dixon. We'd love to have you come down. We have about an 8,000 square foot manufacturing facility there. We would love to walk you through it, show you what we do. We carry all the different hive components. We carry protective gear, smokers, extractors, bottling equipment, bottling machines, whatever you need as far as beekeeping goes. And if you've ever got any questions or problems, you can feel free to email me a picture. I'll try to help you and answer any questions that you have when you come in. All right, thank you.